Already?
Right, do you want me to introduce you, Greg, or you can do that yourself?
I can do that, I guess. Okay, my name's Greg Jenks. I'm here with you for the day. I think I'm coming back in second semester to do a similar kind of program on New Testament. And this is part of a series of workshops that Glenn has arranged for us to come down and offer. And I'm from St Francis College in Brisbane. That's where I work, what I get paid to do. I'm actually from Lismore, so I'm not from very far away, really. So it's good to kind of come back over the border, see the cat for laurel trees. Okay, so let's get underway. What we're going to be looking at today is to try and get an angle, sort of perspectives on the 2/3 of the Christian Bible, which we refer to as the Old Testament. Now, the last 20 or 30 years, it's been kind of theological, political correctness to refer to that section of the Bible as the Hebrew Scriptures or the Hebrew Bible or the Jewish Scriptures or the former Testament. But this is one of the points where I'm just a crusty old conservative. One of very few points where I'm a crusty old conservative. The Jewish Bible, the Tanakh as they call it, overlaps a great deal with some versions of the Christian Old Testament. But they are not the same. Okay? For a start, there's more than one version of the Christian Old Testament, a long and a short form, as well as a few other variations. But the Christian Old Testament is that form of those books which were originally written by Jewish people before the time of Jesus, many of which have ended up in the Jewish Bible, but all of which have ended up in the Christian Bible. Okay? And so the books are not exactly the same, they're not organised in the same categories, and they're not in the same sequence. So the Christian Old Testament is not exactly the same as the Jewish Bible. What happened at the time of the Reformation, the Reformers weren't happy with the Catholic Bible, which was the same as the Greek Orthodox Bible, and indeed the Bible of the undivided church, and so they substituted the larger Old Testament, or they took out the larger Old Testament, derived from the Septuagint, the Greek Bible, and they substituted the books that were known to be in the Jewish Bible at the time of the Reformation. Okay, so for 1,000 years, what most of us think of the Old Testament was not in a Christian Bible. The larger Catholic or Greek Orthodox Old Testament was in all Christian Bibles up until the Reformation. So at the time of the Reformation, and only in Northwest Europe, you begin to get a different version of the Old Testament. So because I'm a bit of a pain when it comes to details like that, I deliberately distinguish between the Tanakh, the Jewish version of the Scriptures, and the Old Testament, which is the larger Christian version, arranged in a different sequence and put in the context of the New Testament, which then makes it a different set of Scriptures than the Tanakh by itself. Okay, so I will keep referring to the Old Testament, even though that's a bit old-fashioned to do that, because I'm just a crusty old sod on some points. Okay. Let me also, this is my screen top, but I also put it into the presentation, my desktop but also put it into the presentation as a reminder to me to say something to you about the Christian communities in Israel and Palestine. One of the great joys of my life is that I get to spend a few weeks, sometimes a couple of months each year working on a dig at the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, at Bethsaida, which is basically 12 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee. And over the last 10 years or so, I've developed quite close links with the Christian community in Nazareth, a little town you might have heard of before. Now, for the Christian communities in the Middle East more generally, including Syria and Egypt, particularly at the present time, but I'm thinking especially of Israel and Palestine, it's a tough time to be Christian. Okay? It's a difficult time to be Christian. That doesn't mean they're being persecuted by the Muslims. If anything, in Israel, they're being persecuted by the Jews. Okay? But it's a tough time to be Christian in a land where Jews and Muslims are facing off, and Christians are kind of the meat in the sandwich in lots of ways. So they're a very, very small community. Less than 1% of the population of Israel is Christian. It used to be around 6 to 10% historically, but because of migration and because of large influx of Jewish people, the dynamics have changed somewhat. But I know that they often feel forgotten as Christian tour groups and others go to the Middle East, visit all the holy places, and don't think there are any indigenous Christian communities in Palestine and Israel. So please do keep them in your prayers, and as they also pray for us. And that picture, if I haven't already said, it's the southern half of the Sea of Galilee. Okay? Taken in February last year when it was still green. A few weeks later it was dead brown. Okay, so where are we going today? We're going to have 3 sessions. First session looking at the world behind the Bible. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. We'll break for coffee. The coffee break and the lunch break are like lungs in the program. It's not that come 10:30 I'm going to get anxious if we're still going. You may be, but I'm not going to be worried if we run over time. But the breaks are to give us a bit of flexibility. We finish 5 minutes early, go 10 minutes after, I'm not too concerned. They just give us space so we can deal with things we need to deal with, but we will break after about an hour and a half. Then we come back for 2 hours, and we'll be looking at a number of what I hope are big picture theological themes in the Old Testament. Then we're going to break for lunch. Then we're going to come back, and I'm going to say a few introductory things, but the point of the afternoon is to focus much more on the role of the Bible in this school's curriculum, or indeed any other school's curriculum. I guess my one-line summary there is that the religious curriculum should be as informed by contemporary religion scholarship as the maths program and the maths curriculum, the science program, the geography curriculum, the history curriculum is by the latest scholarship, research and methods in those fields. And too often that's not the case. Religion is where we dumb it down. Okay, now actually religion is where we should have permission to fly and really push the boundaries and explore things. But we're so nervous of upsetting those 3 parents that actually care about religion amongst our school enrolment base. So I'm basically, because I've worked in schools as well, okay? Now we don't want to lose our enrolments, and we don't want to get Mrs. Smith upset, even though she's from the Assembly of God. Really, it doesn't matter that she disagrees with everything else we do as Anglicans. So I want that last session to be basically you working in small curriculum groups, but that'll be the basis that I'm coming from, that what we do in this classroom should be informed by the best of biblical, theological, historical scholarship. Okay, so I'm going to start by gathering up some questions and then working through the so-called 3 worlds of the Bible and focusing in particular on the world behind the Bible. Thought we might start by just gathering, and I've got a pen and I can scribble on my copy of the notes. And has anybody not got a copy of the handouts? Okay. Thought it'd be good just to capture the things that we think are the most certain, definite things we know about the Bible, and in particular the most definite things we know about the Old Testament. 1 or 2 things that we find most problematic or puzzling about the Old Testament, and anything else that you were really hoping when you agreed to come to this day, I hope they're going to talk about blah. So tell us what blah is, and I'll try and fit it in somewhere between now and 2 o'clock. Okay? So, what are some of the things that we would say are the top drawer, everybody knows this, these are undebatable assumptions we can take into our discussion about the Bible and the Old Testament in particular? I know it's an Anglican school, so it might be a nil response. All right? There might be 1 or 2 things you remember about the Bible. Okay.
Well, the Bible tells us that the Hebrew people were God's chosen race.
Yep. Okay, so it's the story of the chosen people. Yep. That's a big theme. We'll come back to that after the break, actually. Yep.
It's the story of God in the world with a particular people through particular circumstances.
So, okay, story of God in the world with particularity. Particular people, particular places, particular times, and again we're going to talk about some of that in the first bit up this morning. Trying to put the Bible in its place.
And the streets of the prophecies that go with that, a lot of the prophets that were in the Old Testament that obviously prophesied that Christ would be born.
Okay.
That's powerful.
Yep, alright.
The theme of the blood that goes through.
I think it's not history as such, but it contains stories that give meaning to the life and the existence of the people.
Yep. Okay, let me just go back to the prophecy. We're probably going to reframe that one a bit for you as the morning goes on. So anyway, I hope you're still talking to me by lunchtime. Okay.
Consists of very ancient, accurate, now being proved accurate historical records of
Okay.
peoples who were working. I don't know if they were Hebrew.
Okay. Certainly. Yeah. Well, we'll probably reframe that one a little bit as well, depending how much we ramble and how many questions you throw in. But that's fine. Yes, we are certainly dealing with very ancient texts. That's very ancient stories. The relationship between the texts and history and archaeology, of course, is quite contested, and even more so because there's more and more and more archaeology being done. And so for instance, first digression coming up, when I was a theological student way back in the 1970s, we'd have great debates over the dating and the historicity of the patriarchs. Okay, Abraham, Sarah, etc. When I started to teach Old Testament in the mid-80s, the debate had moved to dating and validating the Exodus. Okay, and people just stopped fighting over the patriarchs. Nobody went there anymore. Okay. By the time I was doing it in the 90s, as I kept teaching through the 90s, the debates, as they still are, were actually about the existence of David, and everything prior to David and Solomon was just written off as legend.
Oh, is it?
Okay, now that's not to mean that, the Israelites came from somewhere, okay, and we can do a history of ancient Canaan, which will include the emergence of the Israelites. But it's a very different story if the historians study the history of Palestine in the second millennium. It's a very different story from what the Old Testament gives us. So the big hot button issue in Old Testament archaeology is the 10th century, which basically is David and Solomon. Okay? And everything before that, no serious scholars are going to go in and argue for the historicity. They're great stories, da-da-da-da-da, and yes, there must have been dealings with Egypt, etc., but no major critical scholars of specialising in the Old Testament are going to go to the wall for a particular date of the Exodus or even for the existence of Abraham, which for me, 40 years ago, was a big faith issue. But I've got over it or relaxed or something, got used to it. Suck it up, princess. Okay, sorry, that's a Sally Miller-ism, which has become part of my lexicon, and I've got to be very careful using it in the pulpit. Okay, any other kind of big picture observations like that? Okay.
Just about where have they started the idea of the accurate dating? Is it with the kings that are now historical, say Hezekiah?
Yeah, well, it comes to the question, at what point do we have the kind of data which allows us to be specific? Okay, so which I'm not doing today, but if I was putting up a list of 10 big dates from the Old Testament, that's a good exercise to do, but it's just not one I've got in today's session. But if you tried to make a list of the 10 big dates, okay, you put Abraham at roughly 1800 and so on. You put the Exodus around about 1300, 1280, thereabouts. Put Joshua around 1220. You put David around about 1000 or 980. But then you start talking about particular kings, like the destruction of the northern kingdom, 722. Nebuchadnezzar captures Jerusalem, 586. There's a big difference between saying round about 1800, that's 2 zeros, and saying 586. You've got a definite year. Bethsaida was captured in 731, destroyed, burnt to the ground by the Assyrians. That's history. Okay? Because we've got enough independent pieces of data, we can try and get a fix on a specific date. Now, then you get debates about this sort of chronology versus that chronology, but they're debates inside the historical discipline. They're not debates about, is this legendary or is this historical? So, yeah, and it goes to the kind of text that the Bible is and the kind of information the sort of people writing the Bible would have had available to them as they wrote it. And indeed, even things like, when was writing available, okay, to the kinds of people that we find represented in the Bible? Okay, so that Moses wandering through the wilderness with 2 million people, which is what the book of Exodus portrays. They're very clean. They never left a piece of litter for the archaeologists to find. That's a miracle. But in that kind of social historical context, is that the social context where we're going to find writing in the ancient world? Because writing implies basically a taxation system. The reason you invent writing is because someone wants to A, watch the stars and work out when to do the sacrifices, and B, the king wants to keep records of who owns what so he can tax you. And that's the social function of writing in the ancient world. Now, semi-nomadic people wandering around with goats and donkeys or whatever have no need for writing. They have oral traditions, but they don't have the technology, and they don't have the social structure which supports taking a few people out of productive work and setting them up as tax collectors. Okay, but that's a function of centralised government, and we don't get centralised government in the Old Testament until at least the time of David and Solomon. So anything prior to David and Solomon cannot be recorded with Israelite literature. There may be other literature, we'd love to find it, but we're not going to find Israelite literature prior to the emergence of an Israelite nation with strong central government, because literacy is a function of central bureaucracy. And that's taking big picture paradigms and then applying it down to a specific ancient example. So that's partly what I mean by taking the best of contemporary scholarship and applying it to the way we read Scripture and so on. Okay, so problematic or puzzling aspects of the Bible. We've probably just raised a couple for you now, but what are some of the things about the Old Testament in particular that have been weird, puzzling? Wonder why that's there. I mean, the famous one is, who did Cain marry? But let's leave that one aside. That's for the village atheist. Okay, who did Cain marry? So it's not that kind of story. Okay, but there must be other things you're puzzled about as you've encountered the Old Testament over the years.
I think for me, some of it is the cultural things in the early stories like Tamar and they're sort of, and the number of wives and families, they're just sort of...
Yep, it's a different world.
It's
different
a very
world.
different, and it's all about that mystery, isn't it, that they can...
I mean, Solomon collected women the way rich people now might collect cars and women. Okay? Supposedly had, 300 wives and 700 concubines. Now that's one massive motel.
And a very busy man.
And a very busy and presumably tired man. But the other thing is, there's absolutely no archaeological remains of this amazing domestic complex. Okay? The archaeologists would find a 1,000-bedroom apartment, a pleasure palace of King Solomon. That, even if it was knocked down and destroyed, there'd be evidence of it. Okay? So there are things about the stories that puzzle us because we don't do things that way anymore. Their idea of family is not our idea of family, despite the conservatives saying, let's get back to biblical values. They do not mean one man and 700 wives. It's not what they mean by biblical family values. Okay?
The other thing is
Of course, you can share the housework. Got 699 women.
the blood that runs through the Old Testament.
Yeah, it's very violent, because our world's not violent, right? Watch the news lately. Okay? But yeah, violence has a level of acceptability that, and ethnic cleansing and dislocation and so on, which we would find problematic. Slavery, for instance, is not a problem in the Old Testament. You regulate it, but there's no problem, no ethical problem, no theological problem with slavery.
Yeah. There's a very common, misconception, I suppose. The punitive nature of God in the Old Testament is, with penalty and payment and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
The cause and effect, you've done a bad thing, so God's going to do a bad thing to you.
Yeah. Which strikes us, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, strikes us as brutal, but it's actually putting a limit on the circle of retaliation. Okay, it's actually it's not actually saying you will go and gouge out someone's eye because they've injured you. It's saying just an eye, no more than an eye, which actually is it's an act of toleration and social control. Okay.
And I think one of the other problematic from a teaching perspective issues from the Old Testament is the blend of genres. So it's not just, when you're looking at the New Testament, there's a lovely distinction. They actually give you a hint in their title.
Mm.
But in the Old Testament, especially as you're dealing with kids as they're coming into Year 7, and everything's a fairy story or everything's true, there's that blend of in any one passage, you might have a whole different lot of things going on all at once.
And yeah, and certainly in any one book, because the book of Genesis will have everything from sort of genealogies to family stories and weird episodes of interactions between the genders and so on. Yeah, okay. And of course, I guess one of the big sets of burning questions is, how do we take this amazingly influential, powerful text, which for us is primarily a spiritual text, but when you first read it, a lot of it doesn't seem very spiritual. You know, it's about blood and guts and marriage and land and all sorts of other real world things. And how do we take that and pick it up in the context of school? And where the dynamics are different in all kinds of ways, including, yes, their parents have chosen to send them to an Anglican school. That doesn't mean that either the parents or the children are interested in the religion curriculum. Okay, so there are issues of permission. And how do they're not, partly because they're conscripts, we actually have to get their willing collaboration in exploring Scripture, rather than simply saying, well, you've come to a Catholic school, we're going to shove it down your throat. You know, there's another level of drawing people, taking people with us, rather than simply boring them for 30 or 40 minutes a couple of times a week.
And Sally's comments, a good one that we face all the time, is that it's either a scientific fact or it's a myth, but they don't understand what a myth is. But to them, the myth is something that isn't true, therefore you don't have to believe it. Whether it needs to be a proven scientific fact to be of any relevance. So if this is not scientific history, we can't prove it. Therefore it's a fairy tale, and it's part of it. And it just starts in Year 7, but it gets worse and worse as you go through the alphabet.
Yeah, it may be partly because of how we've offered it to them in Years 1 to 6 as well.
Absolutely.
But certainly at least by around about 8 or 9, if not earlier, I'm a bit out of touch, they are in fact doing genre studies in English.
Yes, they do begin to do.
But do they transfer that to religion? Or does the teacher feel competent and even allowed to take what we've learned about how to read advertisements and how to watch movies and so on, and analyse and look for truth statements, which are different from the plot line? Yeah, why can't we take all that rich hermeneutical principles and apply it to Scripture?
Why not?
Indeed, why not? Indeed, why are we not doing that, I guess is what I'm
Science
saying.
isn't the only science. Modern science is not the only way to find truth.
Absolutely. And so questions of epistemology and philosophy actually have at least in principle, are foundational for education. But, are we just buying into a curriculum agenda set by NAPLAN and graduation to universities and so on? But anyway, we'll never, sorry, go on.
I was the one thing nobody mentioned when you brought up science is the creation story. I teach SRE every year, and every year you do have kids us about, well, is this really true? Is this what God did?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answers half the time.
And my attack, for starters, I'd help them to discover that there's more than one creation story, even in the book of Genesis. Okay? And so that's that little bit of complexity being introduced into the equation can challenge some of the simplistic yes, no, black and white kind of assumptions. So we've got two different stories here. Both of them are true, and yet they're different. So what does true mean? Okay. True is not did it happen this way. True is what is this story saying to me? That's where I would locate truth. Not in the description, but in the significance. Yeah.
I bring it back to that.
Yeah.
I bring it back to personal faith.
Okay. And again, SRE is what when I was a kid was called scripture knowledge, I guess. And so is it ecumenical these days, class-based, or is it still denominational?
it's fairly open. I mean, the Catholics have their own.
Yeah.
And sort of like the rest.
Okay, all right. Yeah, whereas when I was a kid in Lismore, the Catholics had their own, the Church of England had this big one, and I was in the group with 3 other people, which was the Baptist, the Church of Christ, which I was, and Jehovah's Witness or something.
It's central, it's different.
Yeah.
It's central, it's everybody in the one room. It's just the whole class.
Yeah.
And the people that don't do scripture are still in the room, so there's only 1 or 2.
Still listening.
And there's
They're not taking anything in.
no.
Actually, they're probably in the best position because they're not having to pay attention, but they're choosing to. And you're probably teaching them a lot more in a way than what the other kids who are being made to do it and maybe resisting. The kids that are allowed out but they're sitting in the corner, they're actually being exposed to it in all kinds of interesting ways. Let me just comment on a couple of resources. This is a text which I would strongly recommend you have. I'd actually like to see one in every carol in the staff room above the teacher's desk. But it's a brilliant, really helpful introduction to the whole of the Bible. We use it as the basic textbook for Old Test Intro and New Test Intro. The Archbishop in Brisbane liked it so much he gave a copy to every head of an Anglican school in the Diocese of Brisbane. And if the guy from here goes to the heads of schools conferences in Brisbane, he might have got one from Philip at that stage as well. But anyway, it's a great little book. It's Kugler and Harton, Introduction to the Bible. Came out in 2009. Really, really good text. Covers the whole of the Bible. The other one, of course, I have to mention just for ego is my own little book, okay, which is about 3 years ago now, the Once and Future Bible, and it just tries to. It has 12 chapters and just works through the whole of the Bible and tries to look at a lot of the kinds of things that we'll be addressing bits of today. The other book, which is a new one, is not relevant to today's topic, came out about a month ago. It's my new book, Jesus Then and Now, Looking for Jesus, Finding Ourselves. And that'll be more relevant perhaps in the second part of the year, although it's not an introduction to the New Testament. It is more a book about what we think we know about Jesus and what difference that makes for us. I do have copies of those. If anybody wants to get a copy, you can buy them for $20 today if you're interested in grabbing one of those. Okay, so let's go into the main part of the topic. And there's no clock on the back wall, so I will...
So time we want to finish 22 to 22.
Yeah, we're going from sort of 9 till 10:30 as the first chunk. Yep. So we've got just under an hour to go. Okay, so what I want to do is play with the well-established metaphor now of 3 worlds, and hence the graphic. I looked around on Google, of course, to find an image that had 3 worlds all in the one shot. Now, when this is applied to biblical studies, it's biblical scholars picking up the nuances between the world behind the text. Okay, so what was happening back then in the real world? How powerful was Egypt? How widespread was literacy? Etc. All those kinds of things. When again did Nebuchadnezzar invade Palestine? So what's going on behind the text, including how did these books get to be composed in the first place? Which is different from, now I'm looking at the text, what do I find here? Okay, so in terms of literary studies, obviously the focus on the text is more relevant to the second world, which is exploring the world of the Bible or the world within the Bible. And we'll do a little bit of that between morning tea and lunch. So in the first session, I want to be focusing on sort of the world from which we get the Bible to kind of reset some of our expectations there. The third world, which is going to be more relevant to the curriculum session after lunch, is that we're paying attention to the world of the reader rather than the world within the Bible or the world of antiquity. Okay? So in this context, that becomes the relevance of the scriptures to the school curriculum, to the school experience, okay? Or to the parish experience or the SRE experience. So just in very broad terms, the obvious thing we have, of course, is we have a text. Okay? We have the Bible. And we have people who are reading the Bible, either individually or as a community. And in one level, an Anglican school is a community who engages collectively with Scripture. It doesn't mean that every individual reads the Bible with great faith and devotion every day, but there's a kind of collective engagement, interaction between this text and this particular community that we're talking about. So the reader can be an individual, and often is. The reader can be a community, and the community can be a church community, or it can be a school community, or it can be other kinds of communities. Now, of course, a school community does not have the same dynamics in its interaction with Scripture as the Sunday morning worshipping Eucharistic community. There will be some overlap, but these are not identical communities. Okay? And so we need to factor that into our reality, and so we'll be focusing more on the school community. Then, of course, behind the Bible, and a long way away from us, is the ancient world of the southern Levant, or what we call Palestine or Israel. And obviously the Bible comes out of that ancient world, and we know stuff about that ancient world, but we don't live there. It never will. Even when I go to Israel in less than 4 weeks' time, yes, I'll be living in modern Israel and Palestine, but I won't be entering ancient Palestine, ancient Israel. I'll be digging up stuff from the 10th century and the 9th century and the 8th century of Bethsaida, but I'm an intruder. It's not my native patch. Okay? So we are constantly negotiating those three worlds, sometimes intentionally, consciously, sometimes unconsciously. Sometimes we simply make assumptions and then we read the text within those assumptions. Okay? And one of the assumptions, of course, is that what the Bible says happened did happen. That's an assumption, which may be validated or invalidated, but it's an assumption, and it will shape and inform and control the way we read the text. Okay? Now there's a bigger debate which we're not going to focus on today between what are delightfully called the maximalists and the minimalists. Okay? The maximalists, in terms of biblical history and archaeology, want to set the scale up as high as possible in terms of historicity. The minimalists put the gauge somewhat lower. Okay? They're all playing the same game. The point is, to what level do we think the biblical texts are reflecting historical realities? To what level do we reduce the direct historical element, even though, even from an ultimately minimalist position, the Bible itself is, of course, an ancient artifact which emerges out of antiquity. So it's part of the data as well as being part of the problem, if you like. Now, my methodological position is to basically be a minimalist and then work from there rather than set the bar perhaps too high and spend most of my creative energy defending the indefensible. So I tend to I've chosen to go to the other end and surrender as much as the turf as needs to be, and then say, okay, now let's move on from there and see how this text still speaks to us, rather than, because I'm not actually teaching an ancient history class. I could, and I would enjoy doing that, and I've done that within a religion curriculum as well, done courses on Bible and archaeology. But the point of engaging Scripture is not to become experts in the ancient world. Okay? The point of engaging with Scripture is to gain wisdom for what we do in our world. Okay? So we're looking for spiritual wisdom. We're not looking for a Barney over historical questions, which are proper, worthwhile intellectual questions, but they're not the point of a Sunday morning sermon, or they're not the point of a religion class, even though they are dynamics which come into faithful living. We can't ignore them, but nor should we allow them to take over, become the only... all we ever do is argue about the historicity. Part of it, let's just put that in a box and move on. So there's unresolved issues there. One day we may know everything about the ancient past, I doubt it, but one day we might know more stuff. Tomorrow we might find David's palace. End of debate about 10th century. Of course we'll argue whether it really is David's palace. But, okay. Yeah. So first session we're going to focus on the world behind the text. Session 2 I'm going to tease out what I'm going to call 4 major themes, which are, I think, critical themes, important themes in the Old Testament. Now, we could do that by looking at characters. We could do that even just by looking at the the different components of the Old Testament. Torah, first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, absolute formative stuff. That's when the Bible gets invented. Okay, Torah. We can look at the prophetic literature, and if we pay attention to the Jewish understanding of prophetic literature, most of what we call historical books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, in the Jewish Bible, they're prophets. They're not history. Okay? Interesting. So their view of prophecy and their view of history doesn't line up in the same categories as ours do. And the third session, as I've said, we're going to focus more on how does all this scholarship and this amazing text of the Bible, how does that impact on the school curriculum? Okay, so let's begin by putting the Bible in its place, as it were. Interesting how much of the evening news is still focused on this part of the world, isn't it? Has something to do with oil, of course. It's nothing to do with God, but it's very much to do with oil and politics. Because if we were to zoom that out, we'd very quickly realise that Palestine then and now is the bridge between 3 continents. Okay? If in the ancient world, when you don't have jets, okay, you want to move from Europe to Asia to Africa, move between those 3 continents, you're going to be moving your forces, your land forces, through Palestine. So it's an interesting bit of dirt for the Jewish people to find themselves on. I mean, you're going to be trampled every few years by a bigger army than you on its way to somewhere else. And they're actually not interested in Palestine. You're just something they have to chew up and spit out on the way through. Thanks God, that was a really good bit of real estate to give us. We'll come back to that issue.
Is it true that there's no oil in Israel? It's just
Basically, yeah. I mean, there's now off-sea oil and gas fields which are being exploited, or beginning to be exploited, but yeah, basically Israel, like Jordan and like Lebanon, does not, and like Syria, does not have oil. Which wasn't a problem when we didn't have internal combustion engines. It's a bit of a problem for us now. Okay. So basically, and I'll zoom in on a different picture, but let's do that now. Part of the point of that diagram is just to remind us that if there's what's sometimes called the Fertile Crescent. It's not the best analogy for the ancient world, but basically the Tigris-Euphrates Crescent, going through the top part of Syria and southern Turkey, swinging down through the coast of Lebanon and Israel, down to the Nile Valley of Egypt. Okay. Now it happens to be shown in green, but in this map, green is not just green, but the colours that are used are indicators of altitude, not greenness. Okay, not rain. So the brown means higher, the white means even higher. Think snow-capped mountains. Light green means plains, and dark green means river valleys. Okay, so this is not about where to take your sheep to get green grass. It's about where the road is flatter, where the ground is lower, less challenging to traverse. And so there was a natural movement basically around the outside of that shape, and very rare for people just to head west through Iraq and Jordan and go through the desert, basically. Okay? So most of the road systems are in the north and down the coast. Okay? There were no major road systems heading straight across the desert. Now the Nabateans did develop that with the innovation of camels eventually, but normally you would either go by ship, hugging the coast, or you would follow the places that provided water and fodder for your animals. There's a great little book from quite a few years ago. In fact, the book is here. Do you want to hold up Charpentier's book? This is a book that must now be 30 or 40 years old, reading the Old Testament, or how to read the Old Testament. This diagram comes from it, and it was a great introduction. Thanks, David. A great introduction to some of the dynamics around the Old Testament. The point of this diagram, even just at walking past it as we're doing today, is to notice all the large arrows which represent different imperial dynamics as different parts of the ancient Near East assert their capacity to control others. Okay? Rome, of course, is number 6, coming from the west. Greece, the top there, number 5, reflects particularly the conquest of Alexander the Great. 1 is Egypt. 2 is Assyria, basically northern Iraq, southern parts of Turkey. 3 is Babylon, sort of southern Iraq. 4 is Persia, which today would be Iran. Now, the dynamics between those major population centres often centred on Palestine, not because Palestine had any natural resources worth having. It was simply a way to get somewhere else. Okay, so if you're in Egypt and you're expanding your influence, you're going to head northeast. And if you're in northern, what we would call northern Syria, northern Iraq, and you're expanding, one of the directions you're going to expand is down the coast of the Mediterranean and push into Egypt. You've heard they've got gold there, and you want it. Okay. Now the reality is that the northern edges of what we call Israel, the sort of Lebanese mountain range, north of the Sea of Galilee, half an hour or so north of the Sea of Galilee, that was the effective limit of Egyptian political and military control for most of the ancient world, down to the modern period. That was the space. So when we're digging at Bethsaida, 12 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee, we occasionally find evidence of Egyptian presence. Okay, it was basically the northeast frontier for the Egyptian Empire. Okay, so anything that happens inside Palestine, whether we're talking Israel, Judah, Edom, the Philistines, whatever, that can only happen during those short periods when Egypt is relatively powerless and is in chaos. Because the default position is that if you live in Canaan, you live in Palestine, you pay taxes to Egypt. Okay? Anybody who lived in ancient Palestine knew what it meant to be a slave of Egypt. You didn't actually have to be located in the Nile Delta to be a slave of Egypt. You simply had to be within the economic, social and political control of the Egyptian Empire. And by default, when things were running normally in Egypt, they controlled everything up to the Sea of Galilee. Okay? And when things were running badly for them, they withdrew back towards the Sinai Desert and Gaza. Okay? And it's just like a swing that goes backwards and forwards politically from one dynastic period to the next. Conversely, when the people in the north, whether they're Assyrians, Babylonians, Seleucids, whatever, when they're on a roll, they push south of the mountains of Lebanon and head for Egypt. And when they're not on a roll, they stay north of the mountains of Lebanon and they don't interfere. Okay? So whatever else happens in the little bit of land we call Palestine or Israel, it happens in the shadow of the big world interaction between Egypt and, if you like, Babylon. Egypt and Mesopotamia, the two major river valley civilizations of the ancient Near East. Okay? And there are all sorts of dynamics there. These are societies where you regulate labour to control flooding and irrigation and agriculture, and in the off-season you go and beat up the neighbours because you don't want them picking on each other. Okay? So you have highly centralised social systems with work gangs, workforces, and in the off-season the workforce is the army. Okay? And you go a raiding when you're not needed for planting and harvesting. Okay? They tended not to have standing armies. That's a much more modern political thing. You use your surplus male workforce to go and beat up the neighbours.
And they got a bit of plunder.
And you came back with plunder and fresh genetic material with female slaves and so on. Okay. All right. Is that sounding too cynical? There we go. Okay. So here's Palestine. Now, the bottom is the Dead Sea, the top is the Sea of Galilee. The same basic colour system is applying. I'm going to go through that in a moment. This is a tiny patch. When I'm teaching in Brisbane, I tend to say it's no different. It's roughly the same size as the Gold Coast hinterland. Okay? So I guess I'd say it's about the same size as the Northern Rivers, from Grafton to Tweed. Okay, I can drive from, like last year I spent 5 months living at Tiberias, which is sad, but I had to do it, which is 9 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee. It's just over 100 k's from Tiberias to Jerusalem, and with road conditions, most of the time I could do that in 2 hours driving. Okay. You drive from Jerusalem to Ben Gurion Airport in less than 30 minutes, and you've basically gone from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. So it's sort of like driving from Lismore to Ballina. Well, maybe Casino to Ballina with the new roads. Okay? It's not a big bit of dirt. Tiny bit of dirt. Okay? So what are some of the peculiarities? Well, as I've already mentioned, it's the land bridge between Africa and the Asia-European continental mass. It has no natural harbours. There are no major rivers flowing to the sea, and the Jordan is about as big as Wilson's Creek in Lismore. Okay? Sorry, that wasn't meant to be condescending, but that's where I grew up. Okay? The Tweed is way, way bigger than any of the rivers you're going to find in Palestine. I mean, several times bigger. Several orders of magnitude bigger. Okay? Getting across the Jordan River is really not that big a miracle. Okay? So there are no natural harbours. So the people that live here, whatever their religion, will not be a maritime power because there's nowhere to park the boats. Okay? These are not the Phoenicians, they're further north. Palestine, no harbours, no natural harbours, no major rivers. But we do have the Jordan Rift Valley, which is the far northern end of the Great Rift Valley, all the way from East Africa, right up through the Red Sea, and then the Gulf of Aqaba, and then the Dead Sea, up to the Lebanese mountains. So one day it's going to go... Okay. Actually, it's going the other way, but yeah, you get the point. It's a major sort of geological feature. And this tiny bit of land is divided into lots of small regions which have their own microclimates and micro-agricultural potential. Okay? So despite the real estate blurb which Moses was given, this is not a land that flows with milk and honey. Okay? So from very ancient times, do not trust a man who's promising you the best bit of real estate. And there's nobody living there, you can just go and have it for yourself. Okay? You want to buy a bridge? Sell you one of those as well. Okay. So just very quickly, here are the 9 or 10 regions. So we're going to start on the coast. The coastal plain, which today is the heartland of Israel, but in ancient times it was the Philistines. It's the best bit of real estate in the southern part of Israel. The Shephelah, the rolling hills, that's like driving through Bangalore. Okay, gentle rolling hills. Okay, the hill country, but it's what we call the Shephelah, or the rolling hills. If you're going from Brisbane west, it's like Marburg, that kind of area. Okay. Number 3 is the Judean hill country. And it's brown because it's fairly mountainous. And indeed, of course, the mountains in 5 and 6 are the same mountains on the other side of the Jordan River, but they've been cracked in half by the Rift Valley. It's the same geological mountains, same geological features. Okay. So this is stuff the Year 7s might get into, because this is dealing with real stuff. So in the south, number 3 is the hill country of Jordan. The hill country of Judea. And in the rain shadow to the east of the hill country of Judea is the Judean desert. It's a very small desert, only like 7 square miles. But it's like the Western movies where all the baddies hang out. Okay, it's where the Dead Sea Scrolls come from, etc. It's on the shore of the Dead Sea, but it's in the rain shadow. So whatever rain does manage to come, by the time it's petered out over Jerusalem, there's none left for the eastern side of the mountain range. It's desert, as you will see in a moment. Down to the south is the Negev, or the Great Southern Desert. Not yet the Sinai, but pretty dry. I was visiting some Bedouin families down there a few months ago, and it's very, very inhospitable. The Central Hill Country, number 6, which of course these days is what we call the West Bank. But in biblical times, that was Israel. What goes around comes around, so to speak. Okay? And it's slightly better climate, slightly more conducive landform. So the northern kingdom of Israel was always more powerful and richer than the southern kingdom of Jerusalem. But the southern people gave us the Bible, not the northern people. So it has their interests, their agenda. After all, those northerners, they're into golden calves, right? Don't mention the bronze serpent on the wall in the temple. That's entirely different. Okay. The Jordan Rift Valley is this. Now, in ancient times, there were lions down there. It was wild country. It was lush vegetation. These days, it's heavily farmed. The plain of Jezreel, which is a plain running across the top, and that's by far the best real estate in the whole of Israel and Palestine. To the north of that is Galilee, some of which the more northern bit is beginning to transition into the southern mountains of Lebanon. The lower parts of Galilee are not quite so rugged. And then on the other side of the Jordan is the other side of the Jordan, Transjordan, okay, or the Kingdom of Jordan. And of course, prior to the British Mandate, or during the British Mandate, this was just all one country. The British and the French are the ones that drew straight lines on the map and gave us Kuwait, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and so on, because it suited their political interests in Paris and London. And we're still living with the consequences. So just to give you a sense of what those things look like, let me do a 30-second tour of the Holy Land. Okay, this is much cheaper than coming with me to Bethsaida. So we start out at the Dead Sea, where you really can lie on the water and read a newspaper. Just do not open your eyes and don't shave before you go, either face or legs, before you go in. This is 35% mineral salt, and it feels slimy because it's so chemically. Okay, but you can indeed float and read. This is the Jordan River, folks. This is at the baptism site, the southern baptism site, just reopened in the last few years. And this side of the river is Israel, that side of the river is Jordan. Okay, now in Brisbane, that's Oxley Creek, and not down near the river, up at Corinda. Okay, that to me is like Boat Harbour or something like that outside Lismore. Heading back up towards Jerusalem, this is the Judean desert. This is the terrain of the Good Samaritan. That is the ancient road down in there, the bottom of that valley. That's the ancient road from Jerusalem to Jericho. You might just pick out St. George's Monastery, clinging to the cliffs. It's been there for hundreds of years. This is now moving up to the West Bank. This is near Shechem or Nablus, and this is typical West Bank territory. So it's much more, it's not as good as being on the coast or in Jezreel, but it's pretty good agricultural country, particularly for olives and some running of animals. This is the plain of Jezreel. And this is the kind of real estate that does flow with milk and honey. Okay, so this is behind Haifa, in the north, a big valley running from the Mediterranean right across basically to the bottom edge of the Sea of Galilee. In the distance, in the middle, you can actually see Mount Tabor, and that's what Mount Tabor looks like closer up, Mount Tabor. Okay, so you see, this snapshot says a lot actually. Lovely, fertile agricultural land owned and operated by Jews. Arab villages concentrated into a tiny bit of land at the foot of the mountain, but they don't own any of the land anymore. It's been taken off them. Okay. So actually that shot captures some of the dynamics of modern Israel quite well. Mount Tabor is one of the two traditional sites identified with the Transfiguration. The other end of the plain of Jezreel, you have Megiddo, or as the locals would say, Megiddo. So Megiddo is that famous classical archaeological site. I think it has something like 37, 38 occupation levels, and it's basically the site used in Missioner's book, The Source. This is where the inspiration comes from, okay? It has been excavated, and part of it, as you can see over on the left-hand side, is a giant trench which they dug straight down through the tell in order to establish the different layers of occupation.
Is that still being used?
We're still digging. People are still digging there. No, I don't work there. I just play there.
Play.
Okay. So up here are the 10th century city gates, probably 10th through 8th century city gates, which come from the time of the Northern Kingdom, and of course then the part of the debate is how much or any of this, including the city gate structures and the sort of palaces and so on up this end, how much of that might be from the Solomonic period and how much is from the time of Ahab, which is also the time of Elijah. Okay? And there are questions of dating. It's one thing to find the structures, the next thing is to identify the structures and correctly date them. Because of one verse in the Old Testament, which says that Solomon built stables at Hatzor and Megiddo and Giza, with that frame in mind, when they found these stables up the top edge, and when they found the palaces, these must be the ones that Solomon built. There's nothing Solomonic about them, but then we don't know what a Solomonic building would look like. There's nothing. If it weren't for that one verse in 1 Kings, nobody would identify this with Solomon. Because of one verse, if you go looking with the Bible in one hand, as they say, trowel in the other, you find what you're looking for. Others are saying, well, no, these are Israelite palaces from the time of Ahab, when Samaria was very strong. And they did have garrisons at all these towns. So there's a difference of about 150 years. But anyway, it's a fantastic archaeological site.
What are the lowest levels they've come to?
Oh, they go right back to early Canaanite periods. Yeah. And it was abandoned around about the 5th century. This is just another shot of the Sea of Galilee. Because like the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee is also below sea level. Okay, where we're digging at Bethsaida, 12 o'clock on the Sea of Galilee, we're basically digging about 165 to 170 metres below sea level. And there's no water over our heads. Okay. And this is the front gate of Bethsaida. Okay. It was actually an Aramean city. It was not an Israelite city. It was certainly, this fortification is from the 8th, 9th and 8th century. There's an earlier level underneath from the 10th and the 9th century. You can see the pagan moon god Stella with the 3 steps leading up to the altar, the gate structures and so on. So this is a major fortification. In fact, those are the biggest city gates. They're bigger than Megiddo, they're bigger than Hatzor, and they're bigger than Giza. So they're the most significant city gate structures in Israel. They're on the other side of the Jordan River, and this was not ever an Israelite town. Okay, so this was a place David did not conquer, even though the Bible says his kingdom went forever. Okay, way over into Syria. This may be David's father-in-law's palace, but certainly was not a place that David conquered. And then finally there's Mount Hermon, which is that great mystical mountain in the far north, which is snow-capped much of the year, and that's the other traditional location for the Transfiguration. How do we do that? Well, traditionally you just look for a good place for a miracle. Okay? And if you don't want Jesus heading too far away from Capernaum, then Mount Tabor is your spot. And if you think, no, he had to go to the really, really big mountain, then he has to travel all the way up to southern Lebanon to get to Mount Hermon. But we have no idea. Okay, so that was a bit of a quick cook's tour of situation. Okay, now what I thought we'd do is just play with some kind of resources, some kind of strategies that you might actually be able to use in a classroom situation as well. Behind what I'm saying, of course, lies a whole lot of work around the history of the Old Testament world, archaeological stuff, what we know about Egypt, Babylon, what we know about writing, etc., etc., etc. But when we're running a religion program, we're not teaching an ancient history class. We're dealing with texts. Texts that have a history, but texts, more importantly, that have a legacy. Okay, the texts that have an impact on us as we read them. So one of the strategies for getting into some of this is to actually construct a list of characters. In this case, I've just grabbed a few characters from the Old Testament, and then you can have your groups, your students working around what can we find out about these characters? When would we date them? Whereabouts would we locate their stories? For instance, when you read the Old Testament attentively, the Abraham stories are in the south, around Hebron, whereas the Jacob stories are in the centre, around Nablus, or Shechem. Okay? Neither Abraham or Jacob go anywhere near Jerusalem. Interesting. Okay, the stories are not connected with that address. So what does it mean that all the traditions about Abraham are from the south and that all the traditions about Jacob are from the north or from the centre, and what we now call the West Bank? Okay? And what else do we know about the ancient world at that time? Who was the major world power in those stories? Well, in the case of Abraham and Jacob, of course, it's Egypt. Okay? Joseph doesn't go to Babylon. Joseph goes down to Egypt and runs away from Potiphar's wife and da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay? And so what sort of language, what sort of cultural dynamics are going to be at work in that story? You can repeat that kind of a mapping exercise for Joseph, for Moses, for Joshua, for David and Solomon, for the kings around say the Babylonian period, similarly for Ezra, Nehemiah, and so on. Now, perhaps the first thing to do with this kind of a list is to say, who's missing? Who would you expect to be there if you're doing a list of 8 or 10 key figures from the Old Testament? Are there any names? I'm sure there are, but I don't have any in mind. But are there particular characters, particular names you would have expected to be there?
Daniel?
Daniel? Yeah, sure. Okay. Daniel is a big character in Sunday school curriculum, but he's not a big character in the Old Testament, actually. It's a very minor role in the Old Testament. But there are stories about Daniel, so we can do stuff with that. Okay, so again, that's partly how we use the Bible. So, Daniel, there are those. The book of Daniel is in 2 halves. The first half are a whole lot of great stories. The second half is more difficult stuff to read, so we never use it with Sunday school or RE curriculums or whatever.
Russell.
Sorry?
No.
Yeah, Noah, okay, yeah. There's another problem with the list. It's to do with gender.
Abraham and Sarah and Rebecca and Deborah and
Ruth.
Okay. Yeah, so you can come up with a wider list of characters, okay? So it depends how many you're being asked. If you're asked to pick 5, asked to pick 10, asked to pick 20, your filter gets different. At one stage, not for this talk, but for another project I was doing at one stage, I was trying to work with sets of 5, okay? Because one way of understanding the 10 Commandments, and again this is very old worldy, but 5 for God, 5 for man. Okay? 5 rules about getting on with God, 5 rules about getting on with your next door neighbour. Okay? Because when we count them there's 11, but leaving that aside, okay, the idea was cool. The basic idea of the 10 Commandments is 5 rules to keep God on side and 5 rules to keep your neighbour on side. Okay, and most of us have 5 fingers. Not everybody, but most of us have 5 fingers. So that's an ancient teaching device. Okay, 5 of this, 5 of that. So I started playing with that. You try to come up with the 5 most important biblical characters in the Old Testament, and indeed in the New Testament, they're almost certainly going to be males. And that's simply one of the dynamics about the biblical text. It is a patriarchal text. Yes, we can work really hard and we can say, and Sarah, and Rebecca, and Rachel. Straight away we're into sort of bigamy because Isaac has 2. And of course Abraham has a couple of other ladies that are part of his household set up as well. So that invites questions that we may not want to deal with in class. Okay. Noah is it certainly, again, one of the issues is the material that we find easiest to use, some of the really vivid stories, may actually not be the most significant parts of the Old Testament as scripture. But it's much easier to construct a curriculum, particularly in the lower school or in Sunday school, by using the stories, and there's actually a significant curriculum issue there, because unless people know the basic stories, how are they ever going to develop biblical literacy?
So that's why the shorter stories that are only a couple of chapters tend to make for an easier short period of teaching.
Yeah.
Noah and Jonah.
Yeah. In many cases, I mean, Noah's a bit different because that is a story that goes over 3 chapters, but most of the stories, individual stories, are way less than 1 chapter. I mean, even the David and Goliath story, it's less than 1 chapter. And there are several scenes in that story. And the Joseph saga, which extends over 10 chapters or so, but it has a number of separate scenes in it. And we tend to teach we might spend 3 or 4 weeks on Joseph as a character from the Old Testament. And actually, I think that's exactly what the people who wrote the Old Testament wanted us to do, because I think Joseph is there because Joseph is an exemplar of how to survive in the kind of world dynamics that applied when the Bible was being written. In other words, we're living in a pagan empire. So how do you survive in a pagan empire? I think both Daniel and Joseph are example stories for young scribes being trained for their career in the public sector when they're never going to work for a Jewish government. They're always going to work for some other empire. So how do you be Jewish and work for the Egyptians or work for the Seleucids?
Moses didn't get that memo.
Moses didn't get that memo, but it's a model which they know doesn't work anymore. And nobody tries to do that in the 4th century. Something you talk about happening once upon a time, but you don't actually adopt it as a model because they flatten us every time. So part of the Old Testament is actually people telling fantastic stories about the past and being rather more modest about the present.
Sounds like politics.
Well, it sounds like real life, doesn't it? Because it's one thing to have fantastic stories about the past, but you've actually got to survive here and now. And that's part of the dynamic going on here. Okay, let's pick one. Let's take Ezra and Nehemiah. What do we know about those 2 characters?
Well, Nehemiah was the walls.
Okay. So the big story about Nehemiah is he rebuilds the walls. He's the infrastructure prime minister. Infrastructure governor, actually. Yeah.
Wasn't Ezra the Bible, reading the word?
Deuteronomy.
Yeah, okay. Well, Ezra and Nehemiah kind of go together. And indeed, we have it as 2 separate books in our Old Testament, but they are actually the same book in the Jewish Bible. Okay. Yep. So again, there's the differences between the way we tend to know this text and the way Jewish people know the text. So it's one story. They kind of are 2 characters that are both involved with setting up Jerusalem all over again after the Babylonian exile has finished, and we're now in the early Persian period.
So hence you've got Ezra sending back all the foreign wives.
Yeah. See, I know some bits of the story. Yep. So Nehemiah is the governor, the sort of political administrator for the province or for the district, whatever. And Ezra comes out with a more religious role. Okay. Now he's not exactly a priest, and in the way that biblical texts describe him, he's called the scribe of the law of the God of heaven. That's not a bad business card, is it? Okay. You might want to get that on your tag, Chad. Scribe of the law of the God of heaven. In other words, Secretary of State for Jewish affairs within the Persian Empire. Okay? So it all depends how you translate it and what your cultural context. So he's the person who apparently, at least as Ezra tells the story, he's in charge, he's like the Ayatollah in charge of the Jewish communities in the western end of the Persian Empire. So his job is not limited to Jerusalem, whereas Nehemiah has a very specific project of running the government in Jerusalem for the Persian Empire. Whereas Ezra has more a job of organising, or if you like, reorganising the Jewish communities that are scattered throughout the western end of the Persian Empire and are particularly concentrated around Jerusalem. So we get all sorts of interesting dynamics, one of which Sully's referred to. One of the things he does, he insists that the Jewish men in Jerusalem divorce their foreign wives because they weren't Jewish. So he's not really into multiculturalism. But who are these foreign wives? They're from Samaria. They're Jewish. They're just from a couple of miles up the road, 10 miles up the road.
Wrong flavour of Jewish.
Okay. Well, apparently it wasn't the wrong flavour until Ezra turned up, because these Jews from Samaria even had units in the temple compound in Jerusalem. They were thoroughly integrated into the temple in Jerusalem, but they weren't part of Ezra's plan for what it means to be Jewish in the 5th century. Okay? So Nehemiah is busy rebuilding the walls, and Ezra is busy rebuilding the walls of a different kind, and about defining who's in and who's out. And we've been doing that for 2,500 years. So is this a part of the biblical legacy we want to pick up and replicate, or is this a part of the biblical legacy we want to critique to some extent? Okay, there are times when it's helpful to know where the boundaries are, but there are times when boundaries become excuses for violence and hatred and suspicion. Okay? So that's one of the dark sides of the Old Testament. So interesting characters. So in their day, the world power was Persia, so Iran, okay, and the language was Aramaic, not Hebrew, not Greek, not Egyptian, but Aramaic. And Aramaic was the language that Jesus would have grown up speaking. Aramaic was the dominant language from the end of the Assyrian period through until the Arab invasions in the 7th, 8th century Common Era. So for almost 1,000 years, Aramaic was the major language of the ancient Near East, and all the diplomatic work, all the important contracts were done in Aramaic. Okay, and then of course with the advent of Islam, there's a process where Aramaic is replaced by Arabic, and the Christian intellectual leadership of that part of the world actually made a conscious decision to translate all their documents from Aramaic into Arabic, because they recognised something big was happening. Now their texts included the Greek texts of Plato and Aristotle, the ancient medical texts, which the Christian Arabs translated into Arabic, and which the Arabs later gave to the Spanish and triggered off a whole lot of intellectual revival in Western Europe. So there's an interesting story there as well. All right. Let's pick another character. Suggest a woman character from the Old Testament that we could do a quick profile fact sheet on. Deborah. Someone say Deborah? Okay. Deborah. Okay. Deborah actually is from the area of Mount Tabor. Okay. In fact, that sort of village, that Palestinian Arab village on the slope of Mount Tabor is Davoria, the village of Deborah. Okay. So the stories of Deborah and Barak are on the plain of Jezreel, a big fertile plain across the north of Israel. Okay. That was the one place where you could use chariots, really, because you had enough flat land to use them. You can't use chariots in the mountains. Use them on the coastal plain, and the Egyptians and the Philistines both had chariots. You could use chariots on the plain of Jezreel. They weren't much use to you when the going got rough, but they were pretty good on the more or less flat areas. Okay. The stories of Deborah are in the book of Judges, and that's a period in the Old Testament story which is before there's a centralised, stable government system. So before there were kings ruling Israel. And as I said, her location is actually in the far north. So the Deborah stories are not stories from around Jerusalem. they're not even stories from around the West Bank. They're actually stories from the plain of Jezreel. So they're on that edge, that northern edge of ancient Israel, as they're pushing into conflict with the established political entities, the city-states that were around the plain of Jezreel, which would have included places like Megiddo and also Hatzor, a little bit further north from the Sea of Galilee. And those two centres had been the major political powers during the sort of second millennium BCE. Okay? And along with most of the cities, there was a major social downturn that affected the eastern Mediterranean, not just Palestine, around about 1400. At the end of the late Bronze Age, there's some sort of social, cultural collapse. Okay, and we're still trying to work out exactly what caused it, but major drop-off in international trade, major loss of political influence by all the established city-states, and out of that chaos eventually emerged the Philistines and the Israelites, amongst other players. Okay, and that's where the historical kind of matrix for this, and Deborah is part of that mix, because what's really going on with the Israelites is not so much that they're moving in from somewhere else, but they're people from within Canaan, within Palestine, who are developing a different attitude. And in response to the collapse of the cities, the peasants are becoming revolting. The peasants are becoming more aggressive. And so there's this conflict between the established city-states, which have chariots, and the more farmers with pitchforks kind of resist, which is the more Israelite, more sort of militia, people volunteering to go and fight. And so the army is supposedly led by a person called Barak, but he's overwhelmed by the problem, the scale of the problem. He said, I'll only go if you come with me, Deb. And so Deborah leads the army out with Barak, and we never hear about Barak. Okay?
Why?
Yeah. Yeah. But in the context of ancient Israelite tradition, that's an amazing story, because it's a story where a woman is a hero and the woman has a name.
Yes.
Okay? A lot of the time the women in the Bible don't get names. There's somebody's wife, somebody's mother, somebody's sister or daughter. It's rare to get a woman's name. Sorry.
I read somewhere that, that the Song of Deborah, they now believe, is the oldest text or passed on song of history. Was that, did you know about that?
It's one of the actual poem in, I think it's Judges 6. The actual sort of poem attributed to Deborah, the Song of Deborah, is very ancient Hebrew poetry. Yeah.
It's Hebrews.
Yes. Well, apart from a couple of chapters in Daniel, the Old Testament is basically entirely in Hebrew. Which again is interesting, because Hebrew is not the language. It's not Aramaic. Now, bits of Daniel are in Aramaic, but Hebrew, the Bible as we have it, as in the Old Testament as we have it, is written and preserved in Hebrew, which even in the Persian and Greek period was not really the language that the average person spoke. It's like writing the Bible in Latin in the Middle Ages, and it's not what the local farmers were speaking. So there's actually something odd about putting. I mean, a part is reflecting Hebrew was the language of the Jerusalem and Samaria community, but by the time the Bible itself is being composed, most of the people reading it would have spoken Aramaic rather than Hebrew. So there's something almost antiquarian about producing the sacred books of the Jewish people in a language which their grandfathers used to speak, that they don't speak anymore.
I just read a book that talks about this in terms of that kind of exclusive language as being the power language of the language of those in power. So it allowed them to have power over the people that they were dealing with. So if they were talking or reading in that language, and the peasants didn't have that language, then they had a form of power to be able to communicate
Yeah.
and to talk and to keep control. And that's when they started even writing those kind of languages and letters.
Yeah.
Because why Latin was so important is that nobody else could read it.
Yeah.
You know, you go into Germany, nobody can read Latin. Nobody can think of in terms of Latin at the beginning of.
Yeah. So,
Have
I
you got
mean,
the power language?
yeah, these languages are not just neutral languages. So it's I mean, so we start asking the social history questions. Who are the people that are going to be skilled
Yes.
in Hebrew? Well, it's going to be the priests and the princes, particularly the priests and the senior administrators. And they're the ones that have the social leisure and the occupational location, which means they can use this material. Whereas the average farmer, peasant, sheep herder, whatever, he may or may not have any Hebrew, but he's got to deal with Aramaic in terms of his marketing and everything else. So the fact that even at the time that Aramaic has become the dominant language, the biblical texts are being preserved and still written in Hebrew. It means there's a self-conscious, I've never thought of this before actually, so it's good questions, but it's a self-conscious project, and it's an elite project. This is not the spirituality of the common farmer. This is the spirituality of someone like Ezra, who's got an agenda. And our faith is partly the result of his agenda, so we're not complaining about that. But I mean, it's not just everybody was speaking this language, that's why they used Hebrew. No, actually, they probably used Hebrew because it gave it a sense of being ancient, gave it the respect and the authority and the power of being an ancient story, precisely because you had to ask Glenn or I to translate it for you, because you couldn't understand it. And that makes us feel good.
And we may not even be able to write it, but we would have
And
had,
Sally would come in and help
we
us.
would have had scribes that be trained.
Would have been cooking, yes.
The scribes, the
Yeah.
scribes that worked for these guys were actually intellectuals and the skilled craftsmen who were able to write, etc.
Yeah.
And translate it and
Yeah.
pass it on to them.
Yeah, and part of what we had to be doing with this, remember that literacy in the ancient world where it existed is very different from our kind of literacy. Okay? Where we assume if you can read, you can write. Well, no, they're different skills in the ancient world. And so being able to read something that's written was not the same as being able to create the written text. Totally different set of skills. Later still to this thing, as recently as 1978, 1979, when I was ordained, the examining chaplain still had to fib to the Archbishop of Brisbane, because that's what the prayer book required them to do. These men are learned in the Latin tongue. And I'd never done a Latin lesson in my entire theological education, and I didn't do Latin at school because Richmond River High stopped Latin the year before I went in to first form. Okay, so I've never done Latin, so I'm probably not validly ordained. Okay, if not, I think God worries about that. But yeah, there was still a presumption that the people going into holy orders had a technical proficiency not only in the biblical languages but in Latin, because that was like secret priest business. Now there's an aspect, only one aspect, because it becomes more democratic later on, but there's an aspect that the creation of the Bible is an elite project. And it's using, I would say intentionally, an archaic language, which is not the language of the people for whom the tradition is supposedly being prepared. So there's something really interesting going on there. And we, of course, find ourselves by default in a not dissimilar situation that kids in our class, I mean, what we're talking about in Scripture is not the stuff they're into. It's like there's this other elite kind of discourse that we're involved with as religion teachers, and we're trying to bridge a gap because these texts have now become sacred, and we're not simply wanting to throw it out and start from scratch, make it all up. We're now the people of the book, which is a totally different dynamic than the people 2,500 years ago when the book is beginning to come together. Up until then, they were not the people of the book. They were the people of the God Yahweh. They were the people of the temple at such and such an address. Okay, they were not the people of the book. The book was still coming to birth. But we are the people of the book, and that puts us in and our book has been translated into ordinary English. So that puts us in a very different situation from the people in the 10th century or the 5th century or whatever.